Fantastic. Okay, we'll get things gradually underway. My name's Adam Hugg. I'm Director of the Foreign Policy Centre, and I'm delighted to briefly introduce this event, which is part of an ongoing partnership between the Foreign Policy Centre and the Peaceful Change Initiative on the work A Force for Good, examining UK engagement in fragile and conflict-affected countries. We're delighted to be joined by a great panel of people to talk about the findings of the report that Tim Molesworth and I have edited. It's released on the FPC website today. Well, without further ado, I will hand over to Fleur Asimo-Just, who will be your chair for today's proceedings. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much, Adam, and welcome to the launch of this new report on A Force for Good, examining UK's engagement in fragile and conflict-affected countries. We are also delighted to have collaborated with the Foreign Policy Centre on this. The publication that we're launching today is developed in the context of a very significant change, or a set of very significant changes in UK foreign policy and the overall global landscape that the UK's foreign policy is operating in. And the report takes the recent integrated review as a jumping off point for many of the essays and contributions that are included in the publication. But the focus, the red thread that runs through it, if you like, is really on the why and the how of the UK's engagement in fragile and conflict-affected countries. And in particular, many of the essays and chapters in the report provide recommendations for how to ensure that the UK's engagement in fragile and conflict-affected countries can be conflict sensitive. In other words, how can that engagement make good on the UK's commitment to be a force for good in the world? Now, I won't speak long about the report because we have a very distinguished panel that will, of authors of some of the essays in the report, that will give an outline of their thinking and the ideas that are captured. But what I will say, and I can say this with complete honesty in the sense I have had no contribution in terms of writing in the report, but I have read it and I can say it is actually a very good read. And it's a sort of report that there are short essays and chapters that you can dip into and read sort of one at a time. And they're very interesting, lots of interesting angles and facts included. So let me talk a little bit about the process for this meeting today. We have 3 speakers today instead of 4. Unfortunately, Mr. Phil Bloomer, the Executive Director of the Business and Human Rights Resource Centre, has had to drop out from the panel for reason of a bad reaction to a vaccine over the weekend. But he is all right. Nevertheless, we have 3 speakers who have contributed essays to the publication. And what we will do is that each speaker will provide a short overview of the key points raised in their essays. And then after we've completed all of the presentations, we will have a question and answer session. If I can ask all of the participants who are watching to please drop your questions in the Q&A function here on Zoom rather than the chat, that would be great. And the Q&A function should be in the middle, somewhere, middle bottom of your screen. So let me introduce to you our panelists. We have Tim Molesworth, who is a senior advisor on conflict sensitivity and peace technology with the Peaceful Change Initiative. We have Dr. Naho Mirumachi, who is a reader in environmental politics at King's College in London. And we have the Right Honourable Andrew Mitchell, who is a Member of Parliament and a former International Development Secretary. We are going to start with Tim, who joined PCI 3 years ago and, as his title suggests, heads up our conflict sensitivity area of practice, where he is developing some quite exciting new thinking about conflict sensitive decision making. Tim co-edited the publication together with Adam and co-authored with Phil Vernon the chapter on the changing context for UK humanitarian and development activities in in fragile and conflict affected countries. Tim, the floor is yours for 15 minutes.
Thank you very much, Fleur and Adam. And before anything else, I'd also like to express my own personal thanks to everyone involved in this process, particularly to the authors who've contributed their perspectives to the essay collection, and also to all of those we consulted through the workshops and discussions we had around these. I think and feel that the essays raise some really salient points for thinking about how the UK can engage meaningfully around fragility, peace and conflict within the global and institutional context that's changing around us. So it's been a great pleasure to work with everyone around this essay collection. Now I've contributed to this exercise in a couple of ways. Adam and I worked on preparing the top and tail, introduction and conclusion to this together, and helped review and edit some of all of the papers that have been contributed. But I also worked with Phil Vernon to co-author the chapter around the UK's aid contributions. So I've got quite a bit that could be said, but I think for my remarks today, I'd like to focus on 4 main points. The first is on why the UK should ensure that helping governments and communities in fragile and conflict-affected countries to address conflict and to promote sustainable peace should be or continue to be a central part of its foreign policy. The second point that I'll speak to is around the UK's capacity to do so and how that's changing. And third is a bit of a thorny problem around different perspectives about what the UK should be doing and where it should be focusing its efforts around stabilization versus long-term peace building and contributions. And finally is a point around conflict sensitivity. I couldn't get away from talking about that with conflict sensitivity in my title. But I think it's particularly relevant to think about how the UK approaches working through the whole ambit of the tools at its disposal in its foreign policy toolkit. So the first point is thinking about why the UK should engage in fragile and conflict-affected countries, and specifically why it should aim to help governments and communities in those countries address conflict and move to sustainable peace. Now, there are a variety of reasons why this is a good thing to do. Firstly, of course, is its contribution to peace and security. Fragile, conflict-affected countries, or rather, where successful, investing in conflict prevention, conflict reduction, peace building reduces uncertainty in the international peace and security landscape. It can reduce threats to the UK and to other states that come out of instability, out of transnational terrorism, geopolitical competition as well, while strengthening those international norms, which the UK supports around good governance, human rights, and rules-based international relations. Investing in conflict prevention and helping address conflicts in fragile conflict countries also has a huge impact around sustainable development outcomes. Conflict has frankly a staggering impact on outcomes around gender, health inequalities, poverty reduction, education, and the economic opportunities, all of which are at the heart of the UK's aid thinking and approaches. It has a massive macroeconomic cost for affected countries around GDP, on infrastructure, and the access that those countries have to global markets and the potential they have to achieve their development outcomes. And they have a huge impact on the humanitarian cost, the humanitarian burden in the world. By one estimate, 97% of humanitarian assistance going through the UN was directed towards what the UN terms complex emergencies, which are humanitarian crises affected by failing authorities and effectively conflict. The third reason is around the way that engaging in these countries can strengthen the UK's soft power dynamic. The UK is regarded as a soft power as a significant soft power, and the integrated review of this year has highlighted that the objective of being a soft power superpower. It has a strong reputation for engaging constructively around peace and conflict issues, particularly through the former DFID and through the CSSF tool. And together with other parts of aid assistance has really strengthened the UK's moral weight and its norm-shaping capacity, its influence over these questions around international stability as well. So continuing to do so gives us, I think, a significant seat at the table around many of these significant challenges. And perhaps, look, my less favoured argument, but still an important one, is around the economic benefit of engaging constructively around conflict prevention and conflict reduction. Ultimately, as the Pathways for Peace UN World Bank report demonstrated in 2019, prevention is significantly cheaper than conflict response. And the UK's humanitarian burden, the burden of engaging around peace activities, and in extreme cases, the deployment of troops, is much more expensive than the cost of developing strategic projects aimed at reducing the risk that countries might descend into conflict or helping them to resolve it. It's also important in terms of ensuring the sustainability of development and private sector investments that the UK has made. There's nothing more, speaking as somebody who's worked in the field for many years, there's nothing more heartbreaking than seeing all of the work that you've done around building up development activities, or in my case, peace building activities, only to be wiped away by a broader political or military conflict that's occurred, and see all of that effort and money wasted in that work. But even if we see a benefit in engaging and doing this, we still need that discussion around how we do so as the UK. And that brings up my second point around capacity. So the UK has a great deal of capacity to work on conflict issues in fragile and conflict-affected countries. It has strong experience doing so, where out of all of the international donors, it perhaps uniquely or rarely brings together both thematic capacities on issues such as gender and conflict, with a holistic approach to looking at conflict from a wide number of perspectives and angles, and thinking about strategic priorities in terms of how it can support governments and communities to address conflict and build peace. It brings that joined up approach, which between different parts of government and between the different tools that it has to influence peace and conflict in countries. That joined up approach, which of course is strengthened in the integrated review. At least it's called to be strengthened. And that sort of highlights how some of this capacity is also shifting. But of course, the UK's relationships and its place in the world is changing post-Brexit and in terms of its relationships with its partners. But also we've seen the need to change in relation to the changing global context. The integrated review published late last year, early this year, sort of highlights some of the changing global perspectives and the way the UK needs to respond to those. And it puts forward an approach in a number of ways to dealing with peace and conflict countries, which signify a significant change in capacity. Of course, we know that there's a merger. We've seen the merger of the Foreign and Commonwealth Office with DFID and turned into the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office. Now, there are benefits to that, and these are well and truly discussed by now, both the benefits and the pitfalls. But ultimately, it does provide an opportunity to adopt a more joined-up approach, provided, of course, that the significant institutional, cultural differences between those two former organisations can be resolved, are resolved, and that the structural process and ultimately distraction of bringing these two organisations together can be overcome quickly. We've seen the aid budget reduced, the aid being one of the more significant tools in the at the UK's disposal for addressing conflicts and peace questions in these countries. Of course, that's been reduced both as a result of dropping gross national income, but also the dropping of the commitment to spend 0.7% of GNI down to 0.5. We do know, of course, that that will the Chancellor has stated that target will return to 0.7, expected around 2024, 25. But we've yet to see sort of what that means and how that happens, and whether we achieve the conditions that have been sort of put down to achieve that. And we also see that the integrated review calls for a prioritization of countries, a focusing of UK efforts to those countries of strategic significance to the UK. Which of course changes the way it's engaged, but also raises the difficulties of dealing with the transnational aspects of peace and conflict issues. That it's very difficult, for example, as a hypothetical, to look at addressing peace and conflict in Mozambique without also considering issues affecting neighbouring Tanzania. So the prioritization question is one that will really need to be understood in terms of working through how the UK engages moving forward. Now, a few of the tools the UK has at its disposal in terms of working in fragile conflict-affected countries are coercive in nature. Military intervention, Security Council resolutions, championed through its place as a permanent member of the Security Council, perhaps being exceptions. Together with sanctions. But ultimately, it's unlikely that the UK can on its own be determinative as an actor in terms of working in these countries. And this highlights the importance of the UK's soft power, its aid, its diplomatic relationships, its convening capacity, economic, cultural ties, in terms of the value that it adds. But the problem ultimately with soft power, or perhaps rather its strength, is that it depends on perception. For the UK, using its soft power will necessitate consistently matching the language that it puts out around British values about being a force for good with its actions and its behaviour. It also requires bringing other countries along with it, working in a coordinated and complementary fashion with its partners, especially in those areas where we see the growing internationalization of intrastate conflicts, and a wider group of international actors getting involved in fragile conflict-affected countries in a competitive way. But this raises a question about what it is that the UK is doing. And the integrated review speaks to, and this is my third point, about the balance between stabilization versus long-term peace-building approaches. Now, the integrated review speaks to a need to be politically smart within the UK's efforts at addressing conflicts. And that language speaks ultimately to some of the work of the stabilization unit around elite bargains and political deals. Now, that work acknowledges the need to ensure that efforts to advance peace in fragile and conflict-affected countries takes into account the role and interests of elites in those countries, who may be able to determine the success or failure of peace agreements. A lot of peace-building work is on a 20-year time frame in terms of working with communities, and obviously it's no good if that work doesn't take into account some of the political economy questions that play out over 1 or 2 years. So it's a very valuable perspective in that it explicitly recognizes that there may be a need for trade-offs between the need to secure political settlements and the structural efforts to address long-term drivers of conflict. The work around political deals suggests that the long-term structural stuff needs to be done incrementally and in sequence with the political deal-making needed to get towards peace. Now, the importance of making theories of change link to those sort of more narrow peacemaking efforts. However, there is a risk that as the UK's aid programs in particular change, as we move towards a more joined up approach as called for in the integrated review, this politically smart engagement does in practice come to represent a preference for short-term stability over the need for longer-term structural transformation of conflict. And that link of using political deals and elite peacemaking as a stepping stone towards addressing the broader longer-term questions gets broken. There is a concern that some of these elite bargains demonstrate a potential willingness to tolerate or even support some national partners in fragile conflict-affected countries who act in ways that might be contrary to the UK's values over the longer term. And that this would ultimately serve to embed the conflict-driving elites further in society in these countries, while at best ignoring and at worst exacerbating some of the structural reasons why conflict might be there in the first place. A shift to a more cynical approach would also do damage to the UK's reputation as a values-based actor and undermine its credentials as a force for good, not being compatible ultimately with its ambition to be that soft power superpower outlined in the integrated review. So with this, the final point I'd like to talk about, which brings together most of what else we've said, is around conflict sensitivity. Now, conflict sensitivity is a terrible, opaque term. And for the hopefully very few of you who are unfamiliar with it on this call, what we mean by it is looking at recognizing that no matter what you do in a complex environment like one affected by fragility or conflict, you will have unintended consequences. No matter how the UK engages, it will strengthen some actors and weaken others. It will affect the drivers of conflict and the capacities for peace in those countries. So conflict sensitivity recognizes that and then tries to work out how to engage as an approach in a way that minimizes the potential negative consequences of its work and maximizes the ways in which its activities can contribute to peace. Now, the UK is a champion for conflict sensitivity, particularly in the aid world. It helped fund the development of much of those tools and those perspectives. But and certainly that is very much continuing. So at our point in this essay collection, I think, is that as the UK thinks about how to engage in fragile conflict-affected countries moving forward, it ought to ensure that thinking about conflict sensitivity is embedded not just in its aid work at a project level, but is built into its decision-making about all of the activities that it engages in and all of the tools that it uses in fragile conflict-affected countries. Now, within the introduction, we identify 4 key questions that we feel are pertinent to ask ultimately about anything the UK does in these countries moving forward. And the first is around objectives. And specifically, is what the UK is trying to do relevant? Is it needed in the country? Is it timely? And perhaps most difficult, is it appropriate? Does it match the values which the UK holds, and does it contribute to the UK's idea of being a force for good? The second question is whether all reasonable measures have been undertaken to identify and reduce the ways that engagement could cause harm, could exacerbate conflict, and make things and make capacities for peace weaker. The third question is the obverse of that, and have all reasonable measures been undertaken to identify and leverage opportunities to contribute to peace through these activities? And finally, perhaps the most difficult question of all is a question around trade-offs. Are the harms identified in the second question, the ways that the UK might cause damage by engaging, proportional to the benefit proportionate to the benefits that it's bringing through what it's trying to do, and the other opportunities to contribute to peace? Now, answering these questions is not necessarily easy, and that's precisely the point. It's not. It's about ensuring that a certain due diligence is undertaken before the UK tries to engage in any way in fragile conflict-affected countries, surfacing different perspectives around what it is that the UK is trying to do and how to engage. Ultimately adopting that kind of structured approach to considering the conflict sensitivity of the whole gamut of UK engagement in FCACs, in fragile conflict-affected countries, is essential for a country like the UK, with that stated ambition of being a force for good and a soft power superpower. It may not be the perfect solution to addressing that, but it certainly is a way of ensuring that the UK's engagement is as effective and positive as possible. I think I am over my time, so I'll leave my comments with that. I look forward to the other contributions and to hearing and to the question and answers. Thanks.
Tim, thank you very much for that. You managed to cover a lot of the interesting ground in a relatively short time. Can I just ask, or just remind all of the participants who are with us to please drop your questions in the question and answer function. We'd very much like to stimulate a good discussion after the presentations. It is now my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Naho Mirumachi, who co-authored together with Maureen Houch an essay called Unpacking Climate Development and Conflict, Insights for Contexts of Fragile and Conflict-Affected Countries. Now, this chapter in the report makes a very compelling case for integrating conflict sensitivity into the consideration of climate adaptation approaches and projects in fragile and conflict-affected countries. Dr. Mirumachi leads a center called King's Water, which is an interdisciplinary research hub on water, environment, and development, and has carried out extensive research on water security and diplomacy. Dr. Mirumachi, the floor is yours for 15 minutes.
Thank you very much for the introduction. I'm thrilled to be here today. I see lots of people, at least on the screen, the numbers of participants. So I'm really looking forward to the Q&A afterwards as well. I'm super lucky to be following Tim because I think he's just done a fantastic job in laying out some of the key questions around what does it mean to be conflict sensitive? What does it mean for fragile and conflict affected states? What do we need to think about in terms of UK leadership in a very globalizing context? I'm going to zoom in, as Fleur said, onto the issue of climate change. And this is based on some work that I've been doing with Maureen, who is a co-author, and I'm sure she's here. So please do feel free to ask her questions as well later on. It was a project looking at the implications of climate adaptation and mitigation in places like Eastern Africa. And so the examples that I will draw on today will come from this particular region, but I've also been talking widely to various donors, not just from the UK, but from other places and implementers, and asking them about their experiences of conflict sensitivity and how you do this in an increasingly complex world where there's a lot of uncertainty politically, as well as climate change uncertainty as well. And we've got a massive pandemic going on. So how do you really implement, how do you really do conflict sensitivity, I think is a real pressing question. So what I'll do is I'll make two broad points and then one recommendation that we might want to think about, and we can discuss this later on as well. But as we say, climate change is very fresh in our minds, especially those of us here in the UK. The UK has taken a major leadership role with the COP26 last month. If you followed the various plenary discussions, the side events, it was very clear that the discussions repeatedly said that action to deal with climate change is urgent. It can't come fast enough. It's pressing. Also, very interestingly, there were a lot of discussion about the costs of inaction, whether in terms of economic, political, or just simply human well-being terms is much too high. And so a lot of action needs to be galvanized. And so in recent years, we've been hearing a lot about investment in green infrastructure. We are hearing about green development or low carbon development. These terms quite often are interchangeable. For the purpose of this talk, I'll stick to the term low carbon development. But as I say, there's no unified definition. It's quite a loose term, and it covers both mitigation and adaptation. But as the name low carbon development gives it away, we want to reduce our emissions while at the same time promoting development. So low carbon development is very attractive to many of the countries around the world who do need to seek much needed GDP growth, economic development in a way that's much more climate compatible. So we see various low carbon development projects that relate to green energy. For example, it might be dams. These are very much sort of en vogue again, but it could also be programs such as agricultural programs that try and limit emissions as well. So this is a very broad range of interventions that have been considered. The UK, as Tim has already mentioned, has had a long commitment to development, and while aid budgets have been shrinking, not just in this country, but elsewhere globally, it's very much impossible to consider development without a climate dimension these days. So any kind of aid, any kind of development interventions really do have to consider how it's going to be climate adaptive or climate mitigative. In a conversation that I was having with one of my interviewees, it was mentioned that, it's as a development specialist, it's now impossible to think about climate and development as two separate things. It has got to be integrated. And so in fragile and conflict affected states, this this notion of integrating is even more important. In these places, climate change is real, it is certain, but at the same time, climate change is one of the very many factors that relate to uncertainty. So climate change is one, but not the only determining factor that these fragile and conflict-affected states need to deal with. And so when you start thinking about how to consider aid, how to consider development programs, climate change has to be very much integrated into the political economy. It needs to consider the various power relationships that emerge from new development projects, whether they're adaptation or development or mitigation projects. So as I say, I have 2 points to make. The first point is that low carbon development is nothing special in the sense that it's very similar to any kind of development where there are always going to be perverse and inadvertent impacts, regardless of the good intentions and the will to do something about climate change. And so all the more reason to apply a conflict-sensitive lens. With low carbon development, there are always benefits as well as burdens. And we know very well from previous experience that these benefits and burdens both are very unevenly distributed to the local communities. Even if it's a national project, we always have different kinds of uneven benefits to the national as well as to the local level as well. Same for burdens. Even if there might be some national benefits, quite often the burdens are felt very much at the local host community sites. Take, for example, the example of dams. Dams are increasingly being repitched as a good way forward for clean energy. It's not just a simple multi-purpose infrastructure anymore. It's seen as a climate adaptive infrastructure that provides energy as well as water for agriculture, especially in increasingly dry, arid regions or where places where precipitation is increasingly uncertain. It also provides flood defenses. So we're talking about climate-related disasters that can be averted. So climate change as in many ways is encapsulated in this infrastructure project. But dams are very much high stakes because it integrates water, energy, food, and livelihood security concerns. The example that I give you is in Ethiopia, the Gibe 3 Dam. Some of you may have heard of this major dam. It's 250 meters high with a capacity of 1,800 megawatts. It's recently come online and is seen as investment for the Ethiopian government to be at the forefront of producing electricity in a region where there is a growing need for energy. But this project actually has very long roots. It's been discussed for over 20, 30 years. The UK was involved in early stages. It came under a lot of scrutiny because of the fact that it caused a lot of resettlement of people when the dam was planned and developed. And a lot of the resettlement plans were criticized as far from satisfactory. But since the dam has come online and started to produce electricity, there has been an increasing concern about the ways in which these benefits and burdens are very unevenly distributed. So at the local sites, the host community sites of the dam, we're seeing a situation where the energy doesn't go to these local households and just serves the national grid. So the much needed rural electrification is being disregarded in this sense. The dam does also provide water, and so it's being used for agricultural development, but this is for one of the world's largest sugarcane plantation. And there's been a lot of concern that while it's great that there's agribusinesses that are being able to take advantage of this infrastructure project, it's not contributing to local food security concerns in that food staples are not being grown and in exchange, it's going towards cash crops. This is, you can see how water, energy, and food and livelihood sort of trade-offs are being exemplified in a dam like this. But it's also increasingly complex because, as we've seen in the news, Ethiopia has increasingly seen a lot of internal instability. But this particular region where this dam was developed has a long history of conflict involving small arms. And so what we can see is through the exacerbation of water insecurity, energy insecurity, food insecurity, we're also seeing a lot of these conflicts being sort of expanded and becoming even more acute and pointed through these development intentions. So that was the first point about how there are uneven manifestations of adaptive climate adaptation or mitigation projects. The second point is to think about how we need to understand who are the winners and losers. So if there are uneven impacts, well, we need to have a better grasp of who these winners and losers are. Conflict sensitivity will help identify these, and the way we can apply conflict sensitivity is not just to think about winners and losers in a broad sense. So in the case of the Gibeah 3 dam, it wouldn't just be the Ethiopian government that has access to more energy sources, or thinking about losers in the form of the local communities who don't have access to household electricity. I think we can be much more specific than this and think about the long-term effects of interventions of climate adaptation or mitigation, and what kind of long-term winners, long-term losers there can be. One of the things with renewable energy is that it does, once you install it, whether it's large scale or small scale, it does lock in certain pathways to generating that electricity. So if you build a dam, usually it's in place for 30 years. So you are going to be creating a pathway of renewable energy production and therefore uneven distribution of benefit and burdens for about 30 years. Same for small scale interventions as well. We looked into a case of mini solar grids in the Turkana region in Kenya. And what we found was that these small scale interventions, even though they might be at the household level, they do have implications down the line, because it concentrates how capital is generated to install these small-scale projects, and how these benefits of these mini solar grids enable those who have access to energy to acquire more energy. So on the surface, well, at the end of the project, after having installed these various mini solar grids, it seemed as though there were no overt winners or losers. But what we're thinking is that further down the line, it's very likely going to be that those who had access to the mini solar grids in the first place will be able to generate more benefits through commercial opportunities, through diversifying their livelihoods, etc. And those who didn't have access in the first place to developing these mini solar grids will still continue to be excluded and therefore be marginalized in this process of renewable energy production. So this exemplifies, I think, the dimension of long-term, and also thinking about the ways in which the short-term manifestations of benefits don't necessarily give you a good indication of what could happen in the long term. The other way of thinking about winners and losers with a much more detailed conflict-sensitive lens is to think about relative and absolute winners. So this notion of absolute and relative winners and losers, I think, can be best exemplified with another example from this region on a wind farm. So again, a renewable energy project, but it's the Lake Turkana wind farm, one of the biggest, if not the biggest, wind farm on the African continent. It has a capacity of 310 megawatts. There's been over 300, I believe, close to 400 turbines being installed. This was a major initiative by the Kenyan government, and it was seen as an iconic project to attract private investment for green development, green infrastructure. And very interestingly, currently the British investment companies that have pulled together is the largest shareholder in this private sector investment project. And it's a little bit of a shame that Phil can't be here with us today, because if Phil had been here, I'm sure he would have given some insights about the role of the private sector, the role of UK private sector in fragile and conflict affected states. And I hope you'll have a chance to read the collection of essays, but I do very much agree with Phil's point about how voluntary measures are not going to be enough to regulate these private actors that are increasingly working in fragile and conflict affected states. And this is this Lake Turkana wind farm is also another example where it's been very an opaque process, to say the least, about how land acquisitions, various concession agreements were achieved in the process to develop this wind energy project. But going back to the point about absolute and relative losers and winners, this project, this large-scale Lake Turkana wind farm project, is very instructive, because it gives a clear idea of what kind of absolute winners and losers there are. So on one hand, the absolute winners is the national government that has been able to extend its national grid. The absolute winners can also be those who have benefited from the project in terms of investments. But then there are also losers as well, relative losers. So when we start to think about how this region is very much a complex place made up of multiple ethnic groups that are often relying on multiple livelihoods, including pastoralism, not just farming, it becomes a very difficult landscape to just simply say these are winners, these are losers. We need to look into how these various ethnic groups interact with each other and the ways in which the political economy begins to change as a result of the wind farm. One of the very useful examples that we found was that as a result of jobs being created with the wind farm, we noticed that there were some ethnic groups that were being privileged, were giving more jobs than others, which then creates a situation of relative winners and losers. So in general, we might be able to say that a lot of the ethnic communities have been losers in the sense that they have had to go to court to make claims about land rights and their land ownership. They've lost out on pasture land, for example, but we also have these relative losers even within the 17 plus ethnic groups of the region, because of the way the political economy distributed economic opportunities, in this case, jobs, very differently. So I hope these two examples give you a bit of an understanding about why there are these urgent need to look at low carbon development with a more precise lens of conflict sensitivity. And I think I echoed Tim's point about this notion of longer term peace building. One of the things that we've found through our various interviews is that low carbon development ultimately is a development program, and so they run through 3 to 5 to 7 year cycles, and a lot of the times the project evaluations on power relationships and political economy end up being bound to those project cycles. But clearly, peace building and peacemaking is not bound to these 5 to 7 year cycles. They have to be much longer term. And so one of the things that I would make as a recommendation, and here I move into the last part of my talk, is to think about how we can improve our evaluation and monitoring of conflict sensitivity. Various organizations that I've spoken to have talked about integrating it into their everyday operations, not just into these midterm reviews to their end of project reviews, but thinking of it as an everyday exercise where they have got to pick up on these subtle changes in the ways in which these short-term benefits, these short-term burdens might end up having longer-term implications. One of the things that I'd like to end with by saying is that the UK has made very bold statements about being a force for good and how they can demonstrate leadership in this ever complex, uncertain world. But I think one of the things that can be really taken into consideration is a force of good for whom. And I think this is where conflict sensitivity comes into good use. Without asking a force of good for whom, I think we may end up privileging the already existing people in power, those winners already in place, and continue to miss out on opportunities to address these imbalances, these inequalities between these winners and losers. Thank you very much.
Dr. Mirumachi, thank you so much, not least for these very detailed examples that you have provided, which I think often really help to illustrate complex concepts. And what you have done is to make this very specific, very clear. Just before handing over to our last speaker, I want to just give a very quick rundown on some of the essays that are in the publication that we unfortunately won't have time to have speakers on today, but we've got essays on UK peace building and peacemaking. There's an essay on multilateral partnerships, the UK and the UN as partners in peacekeeping and peacemaking. There is an essay on the heavy lift of human security and the UK military in fragile states. There's an essay on the UK private sector interest in fragile states, and also an essay on the importance of gender in fragile and conflict affected countries and the wider women, peace and security agenda. So lots of very interesting and diverse essays to dip into. It is now my pleasure to introduce Mr. Andrew Mitchell, who is a member of Parliament and was the Secretary of State for International Development from May 2010 until he became Government Chief Whip in September 2012. Mr. Mitchell has contributed an essay to this publication called Cooperation and Values at the Heart of UK Engagement on Conflict, which provides an impassioned argument, I think, for a recalibrated internationalist strategy underpinned by values and working together. Mr. Mitchell, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much indeed. And I'll try and keep my comments reasonably brief so that there's some time for discussion after my remarks. And, you know, I think we've already heard two extremely interesting contributions. I will try to range slightly more widely and give you a practicing politician's view of some of the issues that have been raised. So let me start straight away with the whole issue of fragile and conflict states and how we engage with them. They are the most difficult challenges that we face by definition, but they are also the most essential. And why is that? It's because conflict effectively is development in reverse. And by studying conflict states and by seeing what happens there, you realize the importance of corruption, you realize the importance of the fact that unless you see things through the eyes of women and girls, you don't really take part in the debate. And stopping conflict, starting once it's over, reconciling people, and when it's in existence, trying to stop it going on is incredibly important and is right at the heart of what we do. And you know, the integrated review that's been referred to, in my view, was pretty good. I mean, I think it was, to some extent, there was a lot of sort of chest beating and posturing going on. After all, you know, with the current refugee crisis, we need to have our relations right with France, which is 20 miles away, rather than pivot exclusively to the Pacific and think that's some sort of alternative. It isn't at all. So the integrated review seemed to me to be quite good. And in my view, the critical thing is that Britain's foreign policy reach is about values above all, and not about geographies. In other words, we shouldn't be seen as the sort of sidekick of the United States in everything we do. We should be seen as standing up for certain values, things that Britain believes in. And when those values are infracted, as they sometimes were under Donald Trump, we shouldn't be frightened of saying so, because although it may cause tensions in our relationship with America, we're not America's poodle, and it's right to stand firm on the things we believe in, and people will respect us for that, even if they don't agree with us. Now, the challenges the world faces at the moment are many and various, and there's no sign really of them abating. And there are 2 points I want to make about this. One is that at a time when the world needs to cooperate so much more, when it needs to really build the sinews of internationalism, we are, alas, fractured and fragmented into narrow nationalism. Not just nationalism, it's narrow as well. And you see this in the role that's being played by strong men, and it is nearly always men around the world, whether it's President Xi, whether it was Donald Trump as was, President Putin, Prime Minister Modi, Prime Minister Erdogan. These are strong leaders in a fragmented world where the international system is on the back foot. And that seems to me something that could not be worse for our generation, because all the big problems that are trundling down the runway for our generation, and in particular for the next generation, are problems that require more international cohesion and international cooperation. And let us just look for a moment at 5 of them. It goes without saying that pandemics are high on the list. Pandemics will only be beaten when we fully cooperate around the world. They're not beaten in one country, they're only beaten when they're beaten everywhere. And today, the head of AstraZeneca has said that the next pandemic, which will come, and after all, the first and most searingly accurate prediction of pandemics was made in 2016 in a TED talk by Bill Gates. The next pandemic will likely be worse. And, this one attacked more elder folk. God forbid that the next one attacks more younger folk more directly and first and foremost. So pandemics would be at the top of my list. Refugees and migration would be pretty close as well, because the world's planning for dealing with refugees is again much too nationalistic. We know that until you update the 1951 United Nations agreement on refugees, you're not really going to start to make progress. This is not something we can do on our own. And then the third one I would mention is climate change, which hits the poorest first and foremost. And be in no doubt that climate change, in spite of what I would call the sort of holding of the line, the world's efforts are still in intensive care, but at least they're still alive. In spite of that holding of the line, as we see the effects of climate change, it will cause migration. It will be many millions of people who will be migrating, and many thousands of people will die as a result of that. And then, fourthly, you've got the dangers of terrorism, and then you've got the dangers from protectionism as well. And you've also got economic crime. Economic crime denudes the developing world of enormous amounts of money, which is stolen by corrupt politicians or bent business people or warlords. And again, Britain should be doing far more of that. It's calculated that this huge amount of global GNI that goes in money laundering and corruption, some 40% of it may come through Britain and British Crown dependencies and British overseas territories. So my first big point really is that at a time when you need more internationalism, we're getting more nationalism and narrow nationalism at that. So then we come, secondly, to the UK. And the second point I want to make is being no doubt the damage that's been done to the UK by foolish and ill thought through decisions on development. I mean, in the teeth of a global pandemic, when we had the chair of the G7 as one of the key figures at the United Nations, one of the permanent five who has the honor of holding a veto, as the president of the Conference of Parties at Glasgow, COP26, what did Britain do? It relinquished its leadership on international development. There's no way of getting round it. In the past, under successive prime ministers, Britain has been a development superpower. And today that has gone. And that is why it was condemned by every living previous prime minister when this prime minister vaporized DFID and broke our promises and arguably the law of the land on the 0.7. And why does that matter? Because you cannot lead from the rear. If you're the only G7 country that is cutting its aid to the poorest people in the world, its humanitarian support, you can't expect others to step up to the plate, which Britain was very good at doing when we were a development leader, and which, alas, we have slunk back from now. And that is one of the reasons why it's taken so long to get any form of agreement on the COP, and why we are languishing without proper leadership on getting these vaccines across the poor world. And The Economist recently had a front cover which showed the paucity of vaccines in Africa compared to the rich world, and where you see vaccines which are just about to run out of date being rushed to the developing world, where they're not then able to be used. So it's not just the money, it's also the vaporizing of DFID, that center of expertise, not because it was just a bunch of very bright civil servants, which it certainly was, but because it was the power hub which brought in the great thinking from some of the best universities in the world. It was very internationalist. It worked extremely well with those who combat humanitarian issues on the ground, and also those who create policy. It was copied, the work that DFID did was copied around the world. It was indisputably the greatest single engine for promoting good ideas and good actions on international development to tackle this great cause of our time, which is the scourge of inequality, of wealth and opportunity, which disfigures our world. And, under past leaders, DFID could be set up because Mrs. Thatcher had the Overseas Development Administration. It was a center of expertise on development within the Foreign Office. That has been completely vaporized by this unwise and foolish decision of Boris Johnson's. And it means that all that expertise has dissipated. It's gone to Geneva, it's gone to New York, it's left, and there isn't within the Foreign Office anymore now. They're walking out day by day that brilliant British expertise, which was coagulated and brought together at DFID. And the idea that some of these extremely impressive programs that were run by DFID, who really knew about money, will be run by diplomats now who have no understanding of how to run multi-million-pound projects is very disheartening indeed. So that was my second point, really, about the damage that has been done. And my third and final point is, is what assets does Britain have to try and make a contribution internationally? And it goes back to my first point, and it is this, that Britain is at its best when it operates through the international system, because that is where we are able to pull together and punch above our own weight. And we do it through the United Nations, where we're one of the 5, as I have mentioned, but also a hard-working part of the United Nations, where we're right in there in the guts of the matter, holding the pen in certain key disputes and territories, drafting and using our brilliant international network of diplomats to try and advance issues. We are a big force in the Commonwealth, particularly when working together with India and Nigeria, and a very important North-South organization, which I think rather cuts beneath its weight. In or out of Europe, the EU, we are still a major European power. And although I don't think Britain will be doing any more expeditionary warfare in the short term, we have powerful, well-disciplined and brilliant armed forces, which as part of NATO and hopefully making a bigger contribution in UN peacekeeping in the future, we are able to deploy. And then finally, we have the English language, which is of huge help to us, gives us great commercial heft. You know, if you've got a commercial dispute, London is a very good place to have it settled. London's preeminence of a financial centre. These are all assets which can enable Britain to punch above its weight if they are brought together and if we apply ourselves as we should do. But I end on this point that the muddled thinking that was referred to, I think, in the first contribution today, where on the one hand, you are deploying 300 young men and women in the British Armed Forces to Mali to try and keep the terrorists at bay. And yet you've also slashed the spending programs on development, which provide education and health and food across the Sahel, is an act of stupidity and lunacy. Why? Because people through globalization know today what they're missing out on. And if you withdraw those services, you put those men and women in greater harm's way in fighting the terrorists, but you also arm the terrorist recruiter with the ability to say to vulnerable people, look what the powerful, wealthy world has done to you. They do not support you, they do not help you. And that is at the heart of my appeal, say the terrorists. So I'm afraid my message, which I've tried to reflect a bit in the piece I've written, is a gloomy one for the reasons I've said, because of the vaporizing of British development leadership, because the challenges in the world are being met so much by narrow nationalism rather than the internationalism that is required. But I hope that in my third point about the UK, there is perhaps the seeds of how we can make a greater contribution in the future.
Mr. Mitchell, thank you very much for this very frank and as I said before, actually very impassioned contribution, both in writing and now also in person on the panel. So we have come to the questions section. And what I will do is we've got a couple of sort of specific questions to specific panelists, and then if we've got time, I think I will open up some questions for the rest of for the whole panel. There's been quite a few questions to you, Mr. Mitchell. Are you happy for me to sort of put a cluster of questions to you that you can then sort of take a run at?
I'll get a piece of paper so I can put them down.
All right. Okay. So I guess one question is actually it's from me. And that is, you mentioned in your paper that global leaders need to articulate simple objectives to rebuild trust on which cooperation depends, and they need to make a fresh case for internationalism based not only on ideals, but on pragmatism, setting out the importance, but also the limits of positive engagement, which I found a very, very interesting sort of argument. I wonder what role you see for Parliament, for the government, and for NGOs, for civil society in the UK to make that case. That's one question. Then we have a question from participants, which one of which is, about the recent appointment of Sir Stuart Peace, a special envoy to the Western Balkans, and the extent to which this sort of indicates British thinking about hard and soft power that might be used in the Western Balkans. There's another question to you about how the UK can work with others to create more international cooperation to help fragile countries. Maybe we start there, and there are others coming in. Okay, well,
let me have a crack at. Let's start with the Balkans, which I visited actually with a group who were remembering Srebrenica, and it's a very moving experience to go there. But you realise how unbelievably complex the issues in the Balkans are, and also how small events ricochet out of control. I mean, I think the appointment of Stuart Peace is a good thing to do. I think that Britain has not done enough in the Balkans, because given that British troops were deployed there and we played a pivotal role in ending the fighting at the very least, the Balkans is getting increasingly dangerous, and there's a great deal of anxiety in Parliament. There was a debate last week about it. And so I do hope that we are going to deploy our intelligence assets and our diplomacy to see how Britain can make a real European contribution in trying to improve things and row back a bit on the current anxieties in the Balkans. On working with others on fragile countries, I mean, this is incredibly important. And I mean, just the one example I would give was when I was development secretary and I used to go to difficult countries in Africa. I mean, by difficult, I mean fragile ones where human rights were not adequately respected and where there were difficulties. I quite often used to ask to see the Chinese ambassador. And although the Foreign Office was slightly surprised that I would want to do that, it was always very worthwhile. And I think that you know, trying to bring in, and we did stuff together, for example, in the DRC with the Chinese. We had some quite interesting joint work we did there, and trying, you know, to bring different parts of the international community together to help in fragile states is incredibly important. And what we don't want is the sort of previous Cold War balkanization, where, you know, aid was used to keep people in the Western camp rather than the Soviet camp. We don't want that to replay now, with people keeping people in the Western camp rather than the Chinese camp. We've seen a bit of that developing recently, and it just plays to my key theme that internationalism is on the back foot and needs to be reversed. And on your first question about global leaders, and the role of Parliament and so forth, I go back to my point about values and not geographies being very important indeed. And in terms of the role of Parliament and civil society, it is to lean into the political process and try and make sure your voices are heard. We've got a very contentious and difficult bill for the Conservative Party in Parliament tomorrow and on Wednesday, which is the Immigration and Nationalities Bill, which has certainly got a lot of people very anxious and worried. There are several points upon which I remain extremely anxious and worried, and I'll be having my say. I think the time to react to this will be when the House of Lords has spoken, because of course there is in the House of Lords immense expertise in these matters, and we need to draw on that expertise. But you know, the role of Parliament is to restrain the executive. We're not being very good at it at the moment, and we need to become much better. And it is the age-old problem that people want to become ministers. And although we're all sent to Westminster to represent the 100,000 people out of whom we are elected, you know, everyone wants to be a minister. I've written a book actually which describes the 3 phases of a parliamentary career. It's available in good bookshops. It's called Beyond a Fringe, Tales from a Reformed Establishment Lackey. And it does have 2 chapters on development. I'm not trying to preach. I'm trying to tell a story about the importance of development. So I do hope some of those on the call might find it interesting. It's meant to amuse, really, above all, but I hope it might make it into a few Christmas stockings. But the important thing is that Parliament is able to rein back the excesses of the executive. And of course, COVID has made it that much more difficult, because COVID means that ministers have discovered that absolute power is absolutely divine, and rowing back from that after COVID is no easy matter.
Indeed, indeed. Mr. Mitchell, if I can ask you to stay on camera, I'm just going to frame a question for Dr. Mirumachi, which is, I think in your presentation you spoke, and also in your essay, you spoke very eloquently of the need to monitor conflict sensitivity and the impacts of climate adaptation projects on individuals over the long term. And I was wondering if you could elaborate just very briefly on any good examples that you see of this longer term approach to monitoring emerging from your research.
Yeah, we tend to talk about the bad examples or the failed cases, and quite often it's almost a bit hard to come across these successful examples. But one of the things that I've gleaned through talking to different people was that having local researchers, local stakeholders who can help be part of the monitoring and be able to inform these political economy analyses, the conflict sensitivity evaluations are vital. And so we really shouldn't be doing climate adaptation or mitigation at arm's length. We really need to be engaged on the ground and understanding these various local knowledge, the subtle ways in which power relations change. It's not all about corruption. You know, corruption is the one with the big C and always catches the headlines, but it very, very much quite often is about the family relationships, how different people are interconnected in business and in government and local government as well. So being able to understand all of these linkages, I think are important. And so I do, you know, echo Mr. Mitchell's point about the fact that we really do need to have better intelligence, better knowledge, better insights on these regions that we're engaged with. We really can't just do it from a simple report that we collate from here in cold grey London.
Thank you very, very much for that. Can I ask Tim Molesworth and also Adam Hugg to come on camera, because I want to throw some questions over to you as a panel, and perhaps you can each of you can sort of pick what you want to respond to. One of the question that has come up in the chat is around this renewed or new focus within the current UK government on elite bargains as a focus of foreign policy, and why focus on elites who already in effect have the power, have the megaphone? Why not favor support to local actions? What do you see as the sort of the pros and the cons of this approach? Adam, perhaps you start, and then Tim.
Just very briefly, I mean, I think where we're trying to get to in our introductions and sort of the overall approach of the publication is to recognise there is a horses for courses element to this. Obviously, a number of conflicts start out of local disputes and competition over resources that can then be scaled up, and obviously there in particular there is a hugely important role for grassroots work, and grassroots work for any conflict can have a massive impact on sort of mitigating and preventing things from escalating. But there are obviously certain conflict contexts where, it requires a deal by the political elites who, control different factions. They're the ones, with the money, usually with the access to arms, all those elements. So it's recognizing the importance of, track one, and that can sometimes sort of trample all over the best laid community-led project. So it's obviously looking at each project and working out when is most appropriate, and the need for both of them to go in tandem. But I certainly wouldn't. So obviously we're conscious of the turn that government is taking here in the UK. We're conscious that of some of the challenges that approach has, particularly if it's done in isolation. So certainly wouldn't want to undermine the importance of community-led peace building, but it's trying to bridge the gap and work out when which strategy needs to be sort of front and center. But Tim is more of an expert on this than me, so I'll hand over to him now.
Please go ahead, Tim.
I'm not sure I'd claim to be an expert on anything, but hopefully I've got something worthwhile to say. Look, I think this touches on a number of the things that we've talked about. To be quite clear, I don't reject sort of the thinking that elites need to be included around peace processes at all. I don't believe that sort of the analysis that goes into the elite bargains thinking is necessarily incorrect. I think in many instances it is true that you can't get to peace without recognizing the role that spoilers have and the influence that they have over whether political deals get through, over whether there are incentives for conflict or sort of disincentives for conflict. I think the point that we raise, and I think there are some other questions in here that also sort of bring this up, that if you take a position that says that you should never have to sort of engage with difficult characters or hold your nose, how do you expect to be able to have an impact? And I think that's a very fair point. I think the challenge, though, is that there is a risk that if you go too far down that line and the thinking behind that, for expediency's sake, then you end up, that becomes the objective, and that you end up tolerating a situation where you're working with elites to create stability and not to create not to address all of those issues which led to conflict in the first place, and which underpin the perspectives which the UK has in terms of how countries should work within the international order, the values that we have, and so on. I think the point here is that if you go too far down that line, then we won't have that long-lasting impact on peace, and therefore that elite bargain work, that politically smart work, needs to be really tied into theories of change around how you get to that next step, about bottom-up work around sort of the long-term structural changes that are needed for peace building and for addressing conflict.
And just to be clear, I mean, I think obviously most of the contributors to this publication are rightly coming from that bottom-up community-led perspective. It's recognizing obviously the broader political direction of travel is very much down that elite work, and it's trying to sort of gauge where each different tools are relevant, and ultimately, political situations require political solutions, but that's got to be joined up with what's going on at a grassroots level. Otherwise, it's not going to be sustainable, and you'll just be sort of pushing the can down the road for a year or two. Anyway.
Thank you for that. There's been quite a lot of questions that have been posted about Afghanistan and the UK's sort of approach to that country. I think perhaps to summarize the questions that have been asked, the question would be, what are the key lessons learned by the UK from what has happened in Afghanistan in terms of strategic, at a strategic level on conflict sensitivity? And what is the approach likely to be in the future on Afghanistan? Any takers on that?
I'll have a go.
Thank you.
If you like. We're finishing in 4 minutes, are we? Is that right?
Yes.
I better not take too long so that the others can. I mean, I think the lesson of Afghanistan is very stark indeed. It is that you cannot impose democracy or even order with the aid of a machine gun from the back of an armored car. And you wish to think very, very carefully in future about these interventions. I think there's a learning from Iraq, there's a learning from Afghanistan, and my goodness me, there's a learning from Yemen, where the idea there that you can intervene from the air effectively because you're worried about body bags and win a war is just absurd. So I think that's one part of the learning. It is that you should be very wary of intervening when you can't see the exit. I think it's in the highway code that there's a yellow box and it says you're not allowed to enter the yellow box till you can clearly see an exit. And I think that rule would be very good for intervening. But equally, we have to learn the corollary of that, which is that in Syria, where we didn't intervene and where, if we had intervened early on in a surgical way, millions of people would not, half of Syria has been on the move. Half of them inside Syria as internally displaced people, and the other half in the surrounding border countries, and indeed across the Mediterranean into Europe. That's a million of them, 80% of all the graduates in the country. So I think, that just as you should be wary of intervening, so you shouldn't forget that sometimes you should be wary of not intervening. But I think in terms of the impact of what's happened in Afghanistan, I think people will be very, very wary of these interventions in the future. We should be extremely careful. I don't think this country is going to be engaged in expeditionary warfare in the foreseeable future. And we should be extremely careful in the way we deploy force and in the long-term engagements and commitments we take on.
Thank you very much. Is there anyone who'd like to add anything to that from our panel? Okay. All right. I think we are practically out of time. So I think I will call the meeting to a close here. I'm very sorry we had a lot of interesting questions and comments that were posted. Thank you very, very much to everyone who contributed. And thank you very, very much to our panelists, Mr. Andrew Mitchell, Dr. Mirumachi, and also Tim Molesworth. Thank you very much for the interesting discussion. And thank you to the participants for joining us today. I hope that you are able to have a good read of the publication. As I said, it is the style of publication that you can dip in and out of. You don't have to sit down and read all 70+ pages in one go. Adam, can I hand over to you for any final comments on behalf of the Foreign Policy Centre?
Well, thanks. Well, again, we're hugely hugely grateful for the collaboration with the Peaceful Change Initiative on this project. And there'll be some more events in the new year to sort of talk through some of the core findings of this work. So please do, if you haven't already, sign up to the FPC's mailing list. Yes, do have a chance to read the publication, and we're just very grateful for everyone who's been given their time to come today and given their time to contribute to the publication. So thanks very much, everyone.